Well, here's what I'd like to say about it. There's two different reasons that you can be against redistribution, and we're talking about progressive redistribution, that is the kind that goes from the relatively well-off to the relatively worse off. There's two very different kinds of reasons. One, you can believe it doesn't work to help its ostensible beneficiaries. It will create disincentives for them. It will create an entrenched class of dependent people who do not have the right incentives and do not become better off as a result. You know what? That's the best argument. That's the best argument against redistribution. It's a question of fact, and it's one that deserves to be taken seriously. You got to look at your programs and see what they're actually doing. Then there's a very different kind of argument against redistribution that says, no, there's something fishy about the whole idea of redressing inequalities. And the way that argument is usually made today is it's inconsistent with the market. It's inconsistent with the market, and that, of course, is what the Supreme Court said in 1915. That is, redressing inequalities is a way of attacking the market, contract and property. Well, it's a good time to think about that kind of argument, given the period we're living through today. It's a good time to think about it. There's a kind of faith-based economics, a kind of faith-based mentality. If we get rich, it's the market making us rich. If we have problems, economic problems, it's the government. It's just the case that the single two greatest economic catastrophes we've ever had in this country followed directly on periods where we had, in the first case before the Great Depression, the period closest to laissez-faire that this country's ever had. Period closest to laissez-faire we ever had. We get the Depression afterwards, and the current economic crisis is the period of the greatest, or one of the greatest periods of inequality in the country's history. The Gini coefficient was way up there. Now, it may be that really the Depression was all about the, Smoot-Hawley. Yeah, maybe that's what did it. And it may be that today's economic crisis is because of Fannie Mae. But, I wouldn't just take that as a starting point. I wouldn't take that as a starting point that the idea is redistribution is what's causing the problem. I mean, it's funny, we have people like Professor Epstein who, you can begin with one kind of view, you're libertarian, you're against redistribution on deontological rights-based ground, then you develop into a welfare economics, you're looking for, maximized utility, and guess what? Your outcome always remains the same, redistribution last. You shouldn't begin with the premise that already preconcludes the conclusion.
Richard.
Yeah, I didn't recognize my position in that last account of it. So let me see if I can sort of think what I think is. I'm going to start with George Santayana. Those who do not understand the past are condemned to relive it. And that's what I think about what Andy and Jed has said. I do not think the problem is looking in the rearview mirror. When I hear Andy Stern's policy, I see him driving backwards to the 1930s. I had a debate some time ago with Cass Sunstein before Obama was elected president, and I said I thought he was the most retrograde intellectual ever to run for public office. And the explanation for that was the policies he favored had the following components. First thing you do is tariff barriers, and we don't do that through Smoot-Hawley. We just don't allow to have bilateral agreements. Second thing we try to do is to run high tax policies, which is what Hoover did with the 1932 Revenue Act. The third thing we try to do is to strengthen the level of union monopolies, which of course is what happens with the Employee Free Choice Act. So I'm going to make a gift to Andy of my book trying to explain on one side or the other of it.
So tonight I'll be actively reading.
I'm sure it will be the most productive things you will have done in years. But if you actually do the history, it's the difference between Coolidge and Hoover is enormous. Coolidge was a great president on these issues. Hoover was a progressive president, completely inept on every one of these issues. If you're trying to go forward with George Bush, he was largely clueless on some of these things. But the point I think that's most instructive is you have to look at Andy's table. 1973 is his point. it's really the right point to choose. Essentially, in the post-war era, there were no major New Deal reforms, so we were able to absorb some of the costs associated with them because they slowly eroded. Starting around 1964, 1965, there is the greatest burst of legislative indiscretion that takes place in the United States under two progressives. One is Lyndon Johnson, the other is Richard Nixon. And if you're trying to figure out what the source of the difficulty is, start with Medicare, start with the Civil Rights Act, start with OSHA, start with the Environmental Protection Act, start with the Endangered Species Act. You can go through a set of legislative initiatives which turn out in the end not to be concerned with the serious issues of government regulation, which is the control of nuisances and externalities and monopoly, but with all sorts of other fancy stuff. You put those things into place, and what happens is you start to see the overall decline in a productivity system, because far from those things eroding, the only change that you made with respect to them in the Reagan years was that you slowed down the rate of growth. You didn't actually stop and reverse it. The key thing to understand about it is the 21st century with globalization is a greater validation of the wisdom of Adam Smith, not a reduction in it. And the reason it is greater is to the extent that you could get rid of international barriers of trade, the logic of mutual gain through exchange, the logic of comparative advantage could operate on a larger stage. The problem that we have is when we start gerrymandering rules for the 21st century, we act as though that somehow or other, as we go from agriculture to industry to information technology, that this requires a change in legal structure. That is an inexcusable intellectual error. The great genius of the common law rules of contract, property, and tort is that they are variable in terms of their content. You can run a contract in the information age which has very different terms but has the identical rules on offer, acceptance, interpretation, damages, third-party beneficiaries, and the like. And so until you get back to fundamentals, this is just an illusion. We are not looking in the rearview mirror. We have at this point an administration which is so determined to engage in acts of wealth destruction that the long-term prediction is, in my judgment, unemployment is going to go up even higher. If you want to stop it, you've got to get the threat of the health care bill, the carbon tax, and the labor statute off the table. Right now, if you look at firms, for example, and say which ones hire and which ones don't, the difference in the growth of the non-union firms relative to the union firms are an order of magnitude. If you really want to create jobs, you want to shut down every act, you want to repeal the National Labor Relations Act, you want to go back
Richard, it's a good thing you and Andy are sitting at opposite ends.
I'm just going to finish. You want to go back to an open labor market. Everything you do to tighten the noose will strangle the people you wish to help.
All right, Andy, you have some response to that.
I would just say there was a time, where America did work. There was a time in 1973 where there was more inequality. I appreciate, Richard's libertarian free market ideas, and they're very novel and very thoughtful and very illustrative. They just don't work. And,
because they never been tried.
I think we have seen what is caused by when we destroy the forces in society that actually help distribute wealth, that the absolute free market and, now the globalization, actually does have consequences. And I think he also makes the case why it's actually better when engineers in China run countries than lawyers, because, they actually try to make a plan that actually tries to produce result. And America's plan right now is producing inequality. And we can blame the Federal Reserve, we can have 20/20 hindsight. The market does not work in a global economy. America needs to be a team, and a team needs rules that are fair, that allow everybody to share.
All right, I want to get some questions from the audience, and when you do, Ed, why don't you start by directing your question to a particular panelist, and please keep the questions short. Don't give a speech. Yes, sir.
I have two brief questions that are so naive that I'm not sure they should be directed to any individual member of the panel. I apologize for feeling like a 6-year-old girl asking her mother why the emperor's swinging in the breeze. But my understanding is that the greatest equality between any top percentage and the bottom existed when they got to Jamestown. And if you, every period you can measure, you double the income or the wealth, by definition, you would double the separation in absolute terms. And consequently, we should celebrate increased inequality of wealth. unless the median income or the income of that bottom quintile or other quartile, whatever, declines. It's my understanding in the history of the country that just in simple mathematical terms.
All right,
that
so
that's been happening.
what's your question?